Join us this new year for new conversations at the Commonwealth Club.
Thanks, everyone, for being here tonight. I'm Gloria Duffy, President and CEO of the Commonwealth Club, and it is a great honor to welcome you to this evening's program here in the Tobey Family Auditorium, and especially to welcome our honored co-hosts, speakers, and guests. Tad Tobey, who's a Commonwealth Club board member, and his wife Diane are longtime supporters of this institution, hence the auditorium named in their honor. We deeply appreciate their engagement in public programs of special interest to Bay Area audiences, such as this forum. We are so happy that Sean Tobey, their son, is with us here this evening, and also Sheena Penn, director of the Tobey Foundation. So welcome to our wonderful Tobey philanthropic supporters and colleagues. We're especially pleased to see all of you here tonight, in person, for this program in person. The club is, after almost 3 years of mostly virtual programs, starting in March of 2020, we are back to a full slate of in-person programs. Of course, with all of the precautions here, like masking if you wish, HEPA filters, fans, open air, sanitizing, everything we do to keep it safe. We have much more to come this year. You've been watching some of the programs listed on the screen, and of course, they're all on our website at www.commonwealthclub.org. Tonight's program, Open and Accessible, Taking Stock of the Vatican's Holocaust-Era Archives, is the result of an ongoing partnership between the Tobey Philanthropies and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and its Western region. We are pleased to welcome both institutions to the club tonight. The Commonwealth Club is committed to presenting content that stimulates thoughtful conversations, also reflection and understanding about the lessons of history and how those lessons continue to impact us every day. You will learn tonight about how scholarship is expanding as this new access to the Vatican's World War II era archives unfolds, and how that continues to shape our understanding of the Holocaust, one of the darkest chapters in human history. Jason DeRose will be our moderator this evening in unfolding that story for you. Jason is the Western Bureau Chief for NPR News, based in Los Angeles. We so appreciate his coming to be with us this evening. Outside of his journalism career, DeRose worked as an oral history interviewer at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Before turning our program over to our moderator and the speakers, a quick note. As with all Commonwealth Club programs, your participation, whether you're here watching in person or online, is highly encouraged. We want to stimulate debate and discussion. So for those here in person, there are question cards on your seat. Please write your questions on the cards. There will be monitors going up and down the aisles that will take them and bring them up to Jason during the program. For those watching online, please post your comments in the YouTube chat box. Those questions will also be provided to Jason. Now it's my pleasure to bring to the stage tonight's speakers. Suzanne Brown Fleming, Director, International Academic Programs at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and Alexis Herr, an adjunct professor of history at the University of San Francisco. And along with our moderator, Jason DeRose, I know they have a lot of interesting information in store for you. So welcome and good luck.
Thank you so much. And thank you for all of us for joining us tonight. Joining me for this conversation are two scholars of the era the Vatican archives have recently made accessible. In early 2020, researchers studying the era of Pius XII, whose pontificate from 1939 to 1958 spanned the years of World War II and the years shortly after. Dr. Suzanne Brown Fleming is director of the Division of International Academic Programs at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. She received her PhD in modern German history from the University of Maryland, College Park, and she's the author of several books, including Nazi Persecution and Post-War Repercussions and The Holocaust and Catholic Conscience. Welcome. Also here tonight is Dr. Alexis Herr, a scholar of Holocaust history who teaches at the University of San Francisco and the University of California, Berkeley. She holds a PhD in history from Clark University's Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, and she's the author of the book, The Holocaust and Compensated Compliance in Italy. She's currently working on a book about the Holocaust and LGBTQ people. Welcome. Now, both of you have worked extensively in the Vatican archives, some before this tranche became available and some after. So Alexis and Suzanne, let's begin with some orienting questions, because while you know a lot about what these archives are, most of us don't. So what are the Vatican archives?
Well, thank you for getting us off to a good start on this. We're talking about 16 million pages, roughly, in dozens of languages, scattered across archives in Vatican City itself, but also in Rome. And they're covering the years, as you mentioned, 1939 to 1958. The Roman Catholic Church organizes its records by pontificate. So this is what opened in Rome and Vatican City in March of 2020. It was a little bit exciting because literally a week after this decades-long awaited opening, because of COVID, they had to close again. But quickly, actually by June of 2020, they reopened. So scholars have been working away for almost 3 years now.
So when you say 16 million pages, that's 16 million pages from that 19-year period.
Correct. Yes.
How about the archive as a whole? What is the whole archive?
Well, we're talking about 2,000 years of Roman Catholic history. So it's actually quite fascinating when working in the archive itself. The last week when I was there, I was next to a scholar working on a 12th century manuscript, which is, so we're talking about miles and miles of archives of 2,000 years of church history, and many of us are quite interested just in this one small segment. But when you're working there in these archives, you're working among scholars looking at a several thousand-year-old institution.
So this isn't like a public library that you can just walk into. So how do you apply to be able to do this research?
It's complicated, that's for sure. Each of these various archives, there are 4 or 5 large ones and multiple smaller ones. Each is, I guess ruled might be a little bit of a strong word, overseen by a prefect, who's usually a bishop or archbishop, sometimes a cardinal. If you would like to work in those archives, you have to make an application to the prefect. You have to explain your credentials, what your topic of research is, and you have to select the dates you'd like to come. And basically, each researcher is vetted to see whether they are qualified to work in these documents, and then you're allowed your research space. And for the Vatican Apostolic Archive, you go through 3 layers of Swiss guards, which is really, really cool, just to get to the door. So it does require months of preparation and organization and knowing what you want to look at.
Now, how did the era that you are specifically studying, this pontificate of Pius XII, how did those documents become available? Because I understand that they usually take longer to become available to researchers.
Well, this is a little bit of a personal interpretation, but I think that the Pope Francis, one of the things that he is interested in is increased transparency in the church. And as you said, Catholic communities, Jewish communities, worldwide scholars have been pushing for decades to see these records. I consider them the last great closed archive of the Holocaust era that are now accessible to us. And I think if we're judging by the comments that Pope Francis made in March 2019, when he announced their opening, he said, "The church is not afraid of history, and we're going to leave researchers to this patrimony now." So to me, I read that as transparency and a willingness to look at this history in a serious way for the first time.
And learn from it.
Yes.
So I think that's also like, when I think, what are the Vatican archives? It's, the endless files to go through and explore, but it's also for this specific period of history. It feels like a key that has been locked, and researchers have been trying to unlock it for all these years, but we've only had, one side of the door in front of us. We weren't able to go behind it and see what actually happened from the other side. So it's incredibly exciting and such potential. So I'm grateful that the Pope has actually opened. I didn't think that was going to happen in my lifetime. So it's incredible.
Now, Alexis, you did some research. You did significant research in these archives before this group of material was made public.
Yeah.
So were there things that you were, well, first explain what you were researching, but then were there periods when you were thinking, if I could only get my hands on what?
Oh, yeah. And that happens every archive you go to. But yes, absolutely. And just, to backtrack a second, this security you have to go through to be able to use this material in the archives. I think at the time I was a doctoral student, so I think I had to get a letter from my advisor, saying, no, she's actually doing her doctorate. So I had to write to them about the research I was doing, which at the time was on a deportation camp in northern Italy. It was called Fosli di Carpi. It's the largest deportation camp, most significant deportation camp of Jews from Italy during the Holocaust. And it's famous because Primo Levi, Italian Holocaust survivor, went through it. After the war, the camp was repurposed. It functioned for a time as a POW camp, a prison for fascists, and then it was literally occupied by a Catholic priest and turned into a Catholic orphanage. And so I wanted to know about this Catholic orphanage and how it kind of fit into the narrative of Catholicism after World War II. And so I was looking for any document that would kind of speak to that correspondence. And there really wasn't much, because those were the materials that were closed. So the materials that I did find had to do with emissaries who had visited the concentration camp before it had started to intern Jews. It functioned as a deportation camp for political prisoners, and there were some materials that spoke to that. But I want to know about everything else that happened in between. And I think had I had access to those materials, my story could have gone in 1,000 different directions.
Well, now you have another book to write.
Yay! An excuse to go back to gelato, sure. Yeah, I'll take it.
Well, I just wanted to give the listeners an understanding of what these archives are before we start to talk about what you're finding in the archives. So, Suzanne, tell us, you're not rummaging around in drawers. Tell us, shelves, are they indexed? What are the finding aids that have been provided? But those certainly aren't everything.
Yeah. I keep saying this, but it depends on the archive. I mean, the biggest archive, the Vatican Apostolic Archive, which is right next to the Vatican Library, is quite sophisticated. The archivists literally wear suits, is very, very formal. There is a room, an index room, with 12th century paintings that's filled wall to wall just with print indexes of 2,000 years of church history. And the process in that archive would be to pull out one of these index books and see short descriptions of a collection, maybe a paragraph or a few lines, and take your best guess at ordering the boxes for that collection. And you only get 3 per day, so you have to make a wise choice. And then you'll go into another room and complete that process. Very sophisticated. Other archives, for example, the head of the Jesuit order, their archive is also right near St. Peter's Square. And there, it's a little bit less sophisticated, and some of the paper is crumbling, and it's less known and less used. So there's quite a range of one archive does have digitized materials, 1.6 million pages of those 16. Most do not, so it can really vary. Honestly, it's a lot of fun. As like an old school researcher, when I was a doctoral student in the 90s, I was working with paper. And since then, it's been digital stuff on a screen. So to be working again with paper is actually quite a lot of fun.
So describe for me a document that you found. Like how does it come to you, and what does it look like, and what are you looking for when you get it?
Well, so my very first trip to Rome, it was during the pandemic, it was October of 2020. And the whole thing was new to me. I had my official research card. I was very nervous about going through the Swiss guards. Then there are these guys in suits bringing you up to the index room. And I didn't know what to look for. So I fell back on my first book I did on the papal diplomat to Germany. His name was Aloysius Munch. So I went to the index on the years he was in Germany, and I ordered 3 boxes from that. And in the first box, most of the folders are yellow, but in this one box, there was a red folder that said "Against the Pope," and I thought, ooh, what's in here? and in that one folder, it was just one letter. It was about 8 single-space pages from a German Catholic woman who in 1945 wrote 8 single-space pages critiquing the church, just really nuts to bolts. She had a whole history of every single decision the German Bishops' Conference and the Pope had made from 1933 to 1945 and commented on it. And I just thought, wow. Another moment, which was
this a lay Catholic woman who knew that much about the church?
She was a lay Catholic woman. After the war, she became a politician in Germany for the CDU, the Christian Democratic Union. She was formerly a communist at one time and then converted to Catholicism in the 30s, spent time in a concentration camp, was almost murdered in the last month, and survived. And she just was an unusual woman. Ready to speak truth to power. So that was my first kind of wow moment. And there have been a few others that have been pretty wild. Yeah.
Alexis, tell us about a specific thing that you found where you had that wow moment. Maybe it wasn't a red folder that said "Against the Pope."
Well, I bet those have been put back in now. That's the difference. Because I have come across other red folders in other Italian archives. I'm like, you're making me want to open it. But yeah, it's just, it sounds so cheesy, but it kind of all feels like magic to me when I was in the archive, and there really wasn't tons of material even available to me at that point, just because it's so historic and there's so much question around the Vatican and the Holocaust. But one of them was a document that had to deal with this emissary coming to visit and look at this orphanage that ended up being where this concentration camp was. And just speaking of the kind of altruism of this new Catholic orphanage on this campgrounds, but there wasn't any foresight into what does that mean for the memory of the Holocaust in Italy? What does it mean to transform a site of destruction of the Jews into a site of Catholic hope? And there wasn't that forethought, and nor would there be. It was like, not that long after the war. So it's interesting to kind of think about the context too in which these materials are originating.
So what has been the biggest find on your part? Was it that letter?
Actually, for me personally, it was a different letter. We were talking about it a little bit earlier. This was during a June 2021 survey trip, and I was looking through a set of files based on the papal efforts for Catholic displaced persons in Germany. So not something where you'd think you'd find a Holocaust relevant document, but I just thought I'll go through this file. And there was a letter in 1949 where I'll back up to explain a little bit of the structure of the church at that time. There's the Pope at the top, and then within what we'd consider a foreign ministry, the Secretary of State. He's got two top officers, two sostitutos. And one became the future Saint Pope Paul VI, Montini. The other, Tardini, became the Secretary of State under Pope John XXIII. So these three men ruled over 2 billion Catholics around the world. And they met every day. So there was a letter from one of the sostitutos, it was Tardini, to the papal diplomat in Germany saying, we understand and hear that the American military government is ruled by Jews and is against Catholic interests, and that the Mosaic law of an eye for an eye is motivating the American military tribunals in the post-war period. Can you find the names for us of the men who are in charge? And
So this is a letter from whom to whom?
this is from Tardini,
Okay.
who's one of the two top officers directly underneath the Pope, to the papal diplomat in Germany.
Okay.
And the response was a long letter, which had many of the anti-Semitic tropes that were very common before the Second Vatican Council in 1965, and not surprising to me from this particular person writing. I think what surprised me was that the 2,000 years of Christian anti-Jewish stereotypes were still so deep-seated that 4 years after the Holocaust, with 6 million Jews murdered, the Pope and his two top officers still truly believed in this otherworldly power of Jews to be dominating post-war Germany after the Holocaust. And it wasn't facetious. This was a serious letter, send me the names. So I was a little shocked by that.
So what do you do with that? Does that then lead you looking for another letter that person sent? Or where does that lead you?
Well, Alexis, I think will agree that a good historian never makes a conclusion based on one document or even a few dozen. You really have to take the time, and in this case, years. I think we're looking at 5 to 10 to 15 years of solid research in these 16 million pages to pull together lots of pieces of evidence and fill the puzzle out carefully. But I've seen enough now from Montini and Tardini, these two top officers, records of their audience sheets with the Pope, to know that anti-Jewish stereotypes did not end after World War II. They were still something that animated decision-making and thinking until the Second Vatican Council. So I think we can safely say that. I'll just add one thing. It wasn't the only consideration. Another surprise for me was, for example, in the same set of files, defense of German Catholic war criminals was not only based on fear of Jews, but also based on gratitude that the Nazis didn't bomb Rome. There was the defense of the German ambassador post-war from the Vatican was because the German ambassador helped save the treasures of Vatican City, as one letter said. Another factor was so many Catholics left the church to become Nazis, and there was an effort to bring these people back in after the war, and helping to campaign for clemency for German war criminals would make the church popular with German Catholics. So just there was a wide and broad set of reasons for the thinking.
I have so many more. It just opens, hearing you talk just opens all these questions that I couldn't answer when I was doing my own research that I would just love to start looking at these materials for. And one of them being after World War II, Italy voted to end monarchy and become a republic. And the question was, who's going to be in power? And so the Vatican had like a horse in this race. They wanted it to be the Christian Democrats. They wanted Catholics. They didn't want it to be a communist party or a socialist party. That's not good for their marketing, right? And so they were really, involved in this, but we don't have the materials to prove this in all the ways we'd like to. And one of the ways that this kind of filtered out in Italy was there was a widespread amnesty of fascist criminals. And part of this was that there was this fear that if you started to try fascists, who were typically Catholics, that it was going to push the communists and socialists into a more favorable position for elections. And so I'm dying to know where the Vatican sat with all of this. And this gets, into some of the weeds of Vatican's role in, helping prisoners perhaps escape or perpetrators escape after World War II. Because there's lots of information about that as well. But also, I just have to say, on the other flip side of it, I'm just so grateful that these materials are available so we can learn from them. I mean, the message being that after even something like the Holocaust, these dominant narratives of Jewish conspiracy and, Jewish people taking over the world still existing is something powerful to be learned from. So it's incredible these materials are available to us now. Yeah.
Well, Alexis, during your time in the archive, what was the most surprising discovery of yours?
I mean, honestly, it's more about what was missing.
Okay.
Because at the time that I was going, the materials that were available had been collated for researchers. Specifically, there was a request to allow some of this material to be available. You may know more about the history about that than I do, but some of the materials from the Holocaust era was available to researchers, but it had been pre-vetted, basically. And so the materials that I had only showed one color, right? It was just one hue. And so what I was really looking at was just how much was missing, how much of the story I didn't have the answers to. And the way that researchers like myself would get around that is for example, other communities. I was looking at a community in northern Italy called Carpi, and they had a local church, and they would send correspondence to the Vatican. And so I could look at one side of the correspondence, right? So that's one of the ways that people have kind of tried to figure out what happened. So I kept on, thinking like, what should be in these folders that's not here that would help me tell this story? So that for me was my bigger takeaway, like, this is so cool being here. I love being in the Vatican archives. The Swiss guards wear funny uniforms. It was really cool. But I also was like, what else should be in here? And now I honestly did not think in my lifetime I would be able to access those materials. So when it opened, I was so excited, and then COVID. But one day. Yeah.
So you might be able to find the other side of that conversation in letters.
If it's indexed, yes. I mean, it's so much material. I don't know how they're going through and trying to create a guide so that researchers can come in and access that material.
Well, that's what I was trying to get at as to, 16 million pages and you're not rummaging around. So somebody has to organize it in some at least minimal way, and then you can go rummage within certain drawers.
Yeah.
So how does that work? Who's doing that?
Well, I can say a little bit about the Holocaust Museum's Vatican Archives initiative. It's got 3 work streams, but the first is, of course, access and acquisition. So we are working to negotiate with the various archives to make digital copies to bring to Washington, D.C. We're also working together with Yad Vashem, who are also making similar agreements to bring copies to Jerusalem. And we're actually pooling our efforts, the Yad Vashem and the museum, we have a team of surveyors, 5 or 6 people who we go to the archive, we pull out the finding aids. You can't take pictures and they're not online, so you transcribe.
Transcribe?
Yes. Well, you can bring a computer.
I'm still thinking of 16 million pages and transcribing.
Well, but several hundred finding aids. Let's think of it in the terms of the finding aids, the indices. We are going through those indices and looking at the descriptions, transcribing the descriptions and the box numbers, and then we're going into some of those boxes and transcribing what we find. That work will all become basically the finding guides for the museum and for researchers at Yad Vashem, where they then can at least have a hint as to what's in these collections and where they might want to look. So we're trying to do some of the work for researchers to at least make it knowable of, okay, I'm studying the Holocaust in Romania. Okay, I see that I can look into the diplomatic headquarters in Romania, and here are the boxes, and here's what's in them. So that's the work we're doing. It's a 7 to 10 year project because you're literally looking at these paper indexes and transcribing and then going to check the box. And you're doing this at 6 or 7 different archives around Vatican City and Rome once you get your seat and your research card. And
So you're preparing the material
Yes.
for subsequent researchers
Yes.
who will come along and maybe write 3 books on one of those boxes.
Right. And when we're in these discussions with the prefects who naturally have the question, but the documents are available now and their researchers can come to Rome to use them, why do they need to be in Washington or anywhere else? And what we say is, well, at a place like the Holocaust Museum, researchers are looking at them in conjunction with all kinds of other material. If you're looking at the Nazi occupation of Rome and the October 1943 deportation of Roman Jews, you can see the Nazi documents from that era. You can watch testimonies from that era. And you can combine these things and you can have more than 3 boxes a day.
And to add to it, like, again, the Holocaust Museum is incredible because of the efforts that they have done to get materials from all over, Europe, all over the world, really. And so I remember when I was doing my postdoc at the Holocaust Museum, I was able to get materials that came from the state archives in Rome that I didn't get access to when I went to the state archives in Rome. And it was just because they have the materials. They went through the trouble to archive them. But also, too, just to add, like, any good historian too knows that when you get an index of, a box of materials, it's just like the tip of the iceberg. That you still have to dig through it because, there could be, 300 or 400 pages of material in one box. And so the person who's indexing it can't include everything. So you have to go through all of it, which means it takes a lot of time. So having it in DC will be very helpful. I'm very excited to hear that. It's great news.
Are these all written materials like letters, or are there objects as well? I think you've seen photos. There are photos in these boxes as well?
No, I had not seen photos at the Vatican. Other archives I have, but yeah. What about you?
Well, there was I have not seen photos in going through, but there was the first week that they opened, a German researcher from a team at University of Münster found a 1942 report from a Swiss diplomat that did also contain some photos. So you never know what you'll find.
But is it mostly 2-dimensional material, or are there like things in these boxes beyond documents and photos?
I would say only those 2.
Okay. Well, stepping back from the specific things, what would you say have been the major findings of I know this is such a brief period in 2,000-year history, and you've only had a few years to look at it. What have been the biggest discoveries?
What I think this is now, I guess I'm almost 3 years in of going back and forth to Rome for this work. And I'm seeing a much bigger context unfold that I think Catholics have typically studied Catholic aspects. The Holocaust is another very specific line of research, and I'm seeing this much bigger context, all these factors filtering into decision making. And we also hope to learn more about rescue. Something like 5,000 or 6,000 Jews were hidden in Rome and on Vatican property. We know that the Pope knew about this. We know that he let this happen. That's another fascinating aspect, given that we know there are also these anti-Jewish tropes. How do we make sense of that? I think we're going to come out with a much more complex picture than we had before. And it's going to take a long time to really sort through it.
Can you give me an example of some dots that you've already started to see connecting?
Well, for me, one earlier work that I'd done where suddenly I had a light bulb go off was in the early 1930s, the nuncio, the papal diplomat in Germany, was receiving a lot of letters of concern from local bishops saying, I've got all these parishioners who want to become Nazis. And at the time, there was a ban against Nazi Party membership in Germany. If you were Catholic, you could not also be in the Nazi Party. That changed in March 1933. But before that time, lots of faithful practicing Catholics would write letters to the Pope and say things like, I want to be a good Nazi and a good Catholic, and you're not giving me clear guidance on how I can do that. So there was this, my own grandfather left the Catholic Church in 1935. So the church is losing people before, and then I was starting to see the other side of that, where in the Pope's thinking was, how do I bring Catholics back? There was this communist threat that was always on his mind. And how do I bring more Catholics back? And this ties to, as I mentioned before, the efforts for German war criminals. How can I be popular with the German people and bring them back to the church? So that's just one example. But each time I go, there's some new discovery.
Yeah. I want to know more about the communist threat. Like, I want to have a better understanding of how big of a priority that was for the Vatican, because this is, a lot of the scholarship that was written before these materials became accessible said that the Vatican's number one concern with communism, that was the biggest fear. After World War II, you have basically the fear of communism then advancing. And so the question is, what did they do in order to make sure that communism did not overtake Italy and also overtake the Vatican? What threat did they feel that posed? There was a party within Italy after the war, which cracks me up because I think it's so Italian, but they had, a communist Catholic party, which only in Italy I like to think. And eventually what happens is the Pope actually issues a decree that you cannot be both. You can't be communist and Catholic. You have to choose. And so people left the Communist Party, or they doubled down. And I just would love to get more insight into this. I mean, it's the greatest gift, I think, from these materials is that they allow us to ask bigger and greater questions. John K. Roth is a philosopher of the Holocaust, and he has been teaching and studying about this for over 40 years. And he just wrote a book, and he says, the most important thing is that we have to ask questions and think about them long and hard. If we do that, then we can prevent atrocity from happening. People who are in societies that are totalitarian can question the logic that is driving them towards violence. And I think this idea of asking bigger questions is so important. This question of the Vatican, did they do anything? Did they do nothing? It's a bigger question than that. And so these materials will help us get there, and that's the most important starting point.
Well, that gets into an area of questioning that I wanted to move into, which is, so far we've been talking about why this is important work for scholars, but most people aren't trained historians. Most people are never going to go to the Vatican archive. So what is the interest for a general public who will read, one book about this? What should the interest be for that population?
Well, honestly, for me, I'm thinking about more than 2 billion Catholics all around the world who know very little about this history. I certainly didn't learn anything about it until I was about 25, and I think these are big human questions. I mean, one not very enviable aspect of this for the Pope is during fascism, Nazism, and the Holocaust, he was both head of a city-state, he was a temporal ruler, and he's the vicar of Christ on earth who billions of Catholics look to for their model of how to behave. And it's very difficult. I don't really think those two roles can be balanced, but that's the job if you're the Pope. And I think for many Catholics don't know this history. They know nothing about the 2,000 years of Christian anti-Semitism. They're post-1965 Vatican II Catholics who think the Holocaust is an important thing to study, but don't realize it has anything to do with their own faith tradition and who they are as Catholics. So I hope that this is one way to start educating along those lines.
I would also imagine for Jews as well to learn about learn about what the Vatican was doing during this period.
Yeah, I think it's Elie Wiesel who said everything must be reevaluated in the shadow of Auschwitz. And I think that's true. Like, we have to reevaluate our ethics and our morality when we acknowledge that Auschwitz existed, that it was a human creation. What does that say about us as a people? And I think, honestly, this is another question for anyone who is a believer within Christianity, is particularly Catholicism. You know, everything must be re-examined in the shadow of the Vatican during World War II, because it was the moral force of Europe. I mean, it really was. And so the question is, what went wrong? What went right? And, you know, I teach at a Catholic university. I teach at University of San Francisco. There's one class offered on the Holocaust at my university, and many of my students are Christian, and they have never considered the role of the church in any genocide, starting with the Holocaust, but also the role in Rwanda, for example. And it's when you start to reevaluate that which, you know, has sometimes been oversimplified, it creates great opportunity for learning. And through learning, you can become more active in preventing atrocity. So it's everything, I think.
But I imagine it's also scary for students.
It's uncomfortable, but it's great as an educator, because if you get them uncomfortable, then they're listening. They're paying attention. It's great. But so, yeah, I mean, it's uncomfortable, but that's part of, again, I think also the importance of education is you get to expand your mind.
Well, what questions do you still have 3 years in? What questions do you bring every time you walk in there? Or what's the question that you'll bring the next time you go?
Gosh, well, I'm still working on this. The defense of the German criminals convicted in the Nuremberg trials, some of whom were also Holocaust perpetrators. And I guess, you know, it's 25 years in, and I'm asking this really the same question that I had 25 years ago, which is how can somebody raised in a tradition where the dominating animus is love thy neighbor as thyself? How could it be that in Germany, for example, 30% Catholic population, 70% Lutheran, how could they have been participants in this? How did that happen? And, you know, the more you study, the less you understand. Or maybe the more you understand, and it's so depressing that you say it's the less that you understand, but it's, I just want to, I want to understand.
Or sometimes you only want, I found this in myself in reading about this era, is that you want to look at the good guys. So in my tradition, which is Lutheran, there's a lot of talk about the confessing church and the Barmen Declaration. The church, those few, very few, who stood up against it. But they don't talk about the 70% of Lutherans who did not.
Right.
And that there is a sort of a disinterest or a fear of asking, well, but most people did this other thing, and why was that?
Yeah.
I would add to that too. I think I share that same drive, the wanting to understand that which we will never know. It's like we're addicted to a question we can't answer. And I think also too, to add to that is, you know, we want to honor the victims and the survivors in the best way that we can. And part of that is through doing this impossible work of trying to understand how people become involved, good people become involved in systems of mass destruction. And one of the ways that we can honor those victims and survivors is doing the work, trying to figure it out. Yeah.
Well, in a few minutes, I want to get to some audience questions. But so if you have questions, please write them down, and you can pass them back, and they will make their way up to me. But before we get to some audience questions, I want to talk a little more personally about why you do the work that you do. I'm not sure that you could ask these sorts of questions of, say, mathematicians, but you can ask this question, I think, of historians or theologians or literature scholars. So You've both devoted your careers to working in this field, which is a very difficult field. Not necessarily a joyous area of scholarship. So for each of you, why this topic?
Maybe you go first.
So when I was in college, I studied abroad in Milan, and I went to Italy because I was obsessed with this Italian Holocaust survivor, Primo Levi. He's just an incredible writer. I read everything that he ever wrote, and I wanted to visit his grave, which is located in Torino in northern Italy, in Turin. So it's like my last weekend in Italy, and I get on a bus, and I get on the train, go to the train, get on the bus to go to the cemetery where he is buried. And while I'm on the bus, it gets in a car accident, and I get off the bus, and I'm with everybody, and I'm yelling at the driver like, "Perché? Cosa succede?" And then I finally make it to this big monumental cemetery, and it's about to close. And I go up and I'm begging, please, I'm an American, it's my last weekend here. I know you only open for a little bit longer, but please. And they're like, okay, whatever, go in. So you go into this cemetery, and it's a Catholic cemetery, it's Italy, right? So there's all these huge monuments of weeping angels and the Madonna. And in the very small back corner is the Jewish section of this cemetery. And there's no adornment, which is what you will find in Jewish cemeteries. And I'm trying to find his tombstone. I'm looking, and all of a sudden I see it. And on Primo Levi's headstone, he has his Auschwitz prison number tattooed into the stone. And I'm emotional thinking about it now. I sat down and I cried until they kicked me out of the cemetery. I've been kicked out of a cemetery. I'm the only person I know. And so, of course, I became a Holocaust scholar. But so I sat there and I cried because Primo Levi famously committed suicide. He was this person who had this incredible deep thinker who had survived something so horrible and written about it, and then he had tried to do something else. He tried to write fiction, and people got mad at him, you need to continue to be this voice. And I think that mantle to carry must have been just oppressive. And so it's a sad ending for him, but I think of him as someone with such great courage to have done the work. And I just sat there and I just decided that I wanted to dedicate my life to continuing this work. That was it. It was game over.
That's a great story.
But I will say, I did take a class by someone who was a researcher, and her research was on women in comedy. And I think about her all the time, and that is a research subject. I could have done women in comedy, but no. I don't know. Anyways, yeah.
And Suzanne, how about for you? Why this topic?
Well, I also had sort of a surprise moment. I was 25, and I was doing a summer program in Germany, a language refresher course, and we had gone to the opera town of Weimar for the day, and we did that in the morning. It was myself, 2 other American students, and my roommate in the program, who was Jewish, and the first Jewish person I really knew in any deep way, because I had 12 years of Catholic school and I didn't really college. I didn't take courses on any of this. So she said, well, we have the afternoon, let's go to Buchenwald. And this is a concentration camp. And I said, what's that? Wow. And she said, well, it's a concentration camp. And we said, oh, sure. You can just picture how 4 American kind of mid-20s students. We went, and I had spent my whole life in this little town in the Rhineland every summer with my grandmother, who's German, and my association with Germany was, of course, my family, castles, rivers, just picturesque tiny villages, and then we go to Buchenwald, and it made no sense. Intellectually, emotionally, I just couldn't understand it, and this was in 1995, so it still had a lot of the old communist era signage. So there were some mistakes still that have now been corrected. And we went down this one path, like a dirt road, where there was forest on both sides, and there were markers saying Jewish slave laborers and victims of forced marches and Soviet prisoners of war are buried in this forest, just like a small plaque like that. And we come to the end of the road, and there was a tiny cemetery of wooden lacquered crosses, flowers, fresh flowers, with German names and a death date of 1945, and it wasn't really labeled. So all of us assumed that these must have been German guards. It turns out that's not so, but at the time that's what we thought. And my friend, Sarah, just became outraged and said, how can it be that there are these anonymous forest graves, and now we see this cemetery? And the first thing I said was, well, they have families too. That's just what came out of my mouth. It was terrible. I was so ashamed. And she was gracious in accepting my apology, because she's that kind of person, but I just couldn't. I went back to Virginia and I went to my advisor and I said, I want to change my dissertation topic. Now, of course, I'd taken no coursework or anything else, so, hence my fellowship at the Holocaust Museum. But yeah, and then I just changed to German Catholics, the Church, and the Holocaust, and that was it.
So you mentioned earlier that you are Catholic yourself,
Yes.
working in this era. You mentioned that you have familial relations in Germany. Your grandfather left the Catholic Church
Yes.
to become a Nazi. So you embody this history. So how is it to work in this field when you are part of it as well?
I don't know if it's, well, let me put it this way. You know, I've been 22 years at the Holocaust Museum, and I meet our survivor volunteers and their families and their children and their grandchildren, and they are amazing people. And I've dedicated a couple of my books to Randy Bram, who's the Holocaust survivor from Romania, or Zev Weiss, who founded the Holocaust Educational Foundation in Chicago. These families know what it's like to suffer and be confused and have trauma that goes through generations. And it's amazing what many have built and many couldn't. So I just choose to think about that.
Well, we will be getting to audience questions in a minute, but I just wanted to end with a few questions about, is there anything you wish you hadn't found?
Oh, everything that I find. I'm just kidding.
Maybe because it's too sad, or is it this should best be lost to history? Maybe historians don't think that way.
I mean, I don't feel that way. Even the stuff that's hard is, sometimes it's the last remnants of an individual who no longer exists.
And I feel it's a matter of justice. It's a matter
Yeah.
of justice. This study is a matter of justice, and it does honor the memory, but you can't, if you take somebody like my grandfather, who after the war, a few years in prison, and then he just lived a normal life after the things he did, that's not fair. With the families that I meet who have suffered and lost so much, it's just not a fair balance.
One thing that it kind of haunts me a little bit, I wonder if it will work. I have some photos. I did research on the camp that was converted into a Catholic orphanage. So this is during the war. But afterwards, these orphans that had been accumulating during the Second World War basically occupied this camp. They showed up. They didn't have permission to be there. They just showed up and started singing songs and pushed their way through barbed wire and took over this camp and transformed it. And So there's these incredible photos of these war orphans who are literally pushing down the walls of a former camp. And they convert them, these 29 barracks, into rooms and schoolrooms and churches. And it's just really wild. This is a propaganda photo that was used to promote this incredible project. Here's Don Zeno Saltino, the man who was responsible. They're praying on the grounds of this deportation camp. And I just so here's a wedding being held at the camp. You can see the guard tower in the back, and on the left is a child being walked. And the thing that haunts me are these war orphans. I don't know who they are, and I wonder if they're Jewish. And that's a whole other aspect of this history within Italy and the Holocaust, are these orphans and what happened to them. Here's another one of the guy who founded it, Don Zeno Saltini, playing a accordion. But that's something that haunts me, and I'll never know the answers to. Yeah.
What is the greater goal of both your work? I mean, you mentioned justice.
Truth and transparency. It's the best way for the church. It's the best way for families. It's the best way for everyone.
I agree, and I think for me, it's, I want to honor the victims. I want to support survivors and learn how to better support survivors. I don't think we did enough for Holocaust survivors and are learning from that. I think we can apply the lessons we learned to survivors of modern genocide. And I want to prevent genocide, and I think you can do that in part through education. That's just one of the tools in the toolkit that I'm happy to participate in. But so it's, all of these things and so much more.
It seems that the work of telling the truth has become harder recently when we've become almost inured to the idea that people lie constantly, baldly. And so how does your work bear witness to the importance of truth?
That's the great thing about archives. The paper says what it says. I mean, the museum opened recently, the David and Fela Chappelle Center for our research and collections, and we have a place where we are storing all kinds of evidence. It's evidence, and it does these materials, these objects, the testimonies, photographs, and archival record. Nobody, they're not disputable, and you see them, you can read them, and they say what they say. I think it's so important to preserve that evidence. It's crucial.
Yeah. Also, to add to that too, is we know that Holocaust denial is alive and present, and that's part of the current of the alt-right, and it's essential to have something to combat that with. And so archival materials are essential, but also having prominent politicians acknowledge the Holocaust, visit the Holocaust Museum, or celebrities. These things have an impact and help individuals learn from what has happened. And so that's incredibly key.
Well, I want to spend a few minutes doing some audience questions, and I have one here that I probably should have asked very early on, which is, how are the materials in the archive collected? Is there a person who just puts things into boxes, or who's doing that very collecting part?
Do you? Is it a question about how the Vatican collects its materials, or how the museum collects the materials?
I'm sorry, the Vatican archive, I think. How are they collected, and who decides what's kept?
Well, they keep everything. They keep absolutely everything.
Yeah.
And then one reason it took so long for the archives to open And I don't think that this was fake news. Was, have these millions of pages, and then archivists have to go in and create thematic. The folders are divided by theme, sometimes by year, other times by theme. So somebody needs to go through these papers, classify them and categorize them by year, by subject, by type of material.
Language.
By language, put them in an order, number the pages. And that is what, in fact, that took, I think, more than almost 20 years to do for the Pius XII papers. So it's very, very systematic and slow work.
Another question from the audience. Have you been refused access to anything that you think should be available? As in, like, something looks missing, like it's missing, like pages 2 goes to page 5. Suddenly 3 and 4 are gone.
I've not experienced that. I do believe that this is a transparent opening of everything.
Which is amazing too, because having done research in the government archives as well in Italy, that is not the case. I'm sure that's still not the case in Italy. So I remember one of the collections I wanted to see was at a state archive, and I wanted to look at fascist prisoners who were interned at this camp after the war. And in order to get permission to do that, I had to petition the police. They never responded, so I'm still waiting. But so, like, there are governments that don't do this. I mean, it's incredible that this has been the decision.
I like this. I like this question. I know what your answers are going to be to this. Is there ever a time that you anticipate that there is nothing more left to learn about the Holocaust? No.
Nah.
Well, there's still so much stuff to collect. I mean, it's amazing. I wish I could. I'm not going to give the number precisely, but I know the museum is still receiving dozens and dozens of new collections, just personal donations, every single month. And if you go in archives and attics across Europe, there's still so much stuff. My colleague Zach Levine was telling me that in Budapest, an old building, this just happened a few weeks ago, an old building was being torn down, and in a back secret room were the archives of the Budapest Jewish community. Wow. In a moldy old hidden back room that now, of course, will be rescued. Wow. But there's so much stuff still to come in. It's just incredible.
And so stuff is still coming into the collection about that era.
Yes.
So it's not it's not like this is all we have and all we're ever going to have.
Oh,
it's
no.
Still being built.
No, and also, too, the relevancy of this material expands and changes. I think about with the BLM movement, there's been more interest in what happened to African Germans during the Holocaust. And so there's been greater, I imagine there's probably been a lot more use of those archival materials at the museum. Or right now with what's going on politically in this country with transgender people, there's been more interest about what happened to queer-eyed people during the Holocaust. Like, these questions emerge in new ways and become relevant in new ways according to whatever generation you're in. So there's stuff to be learned endlessly.
Well, you're working on a book on that very topic, right?
Yeah,
right
and
now.
one of the things that's crazy too is in terms of trying to access materials about lesbians or gay men during the Holocaust or transgender people or intersex, is we just don't have tons of material on it. People had to hide after the war. Homosexuality remained illegal until 1969 in Germany. So the materials that we have often were destroyed or are hidden, or maybe we'll still find them one day. So the opportunity for learning is endless.
I remember when I worked at the Holocaust Museum back in the mid-90s as an oral history interviewer, I went through, and I remember there was only one place where sexual orientation was mentioned. I don't know if that's changed or not, but I remember thinking this only appears in one sentence in the museum.
Yeah.
So there's much more
Yeah.
Much more still to do.
And like just too, like I know the museum is, I'm not sure when they're reopening the permanent exhibit or if it's
open,
It's
yes.
opened. Okay. So yeah. So I mean, that just goes to show that we're always revising and expanding what we know. Yeah.
Okay, another question reads, I assume the book, The Pope and Mussolini, was written without access to the Vatican archives, or especially this tranche. How do you think access to those archives will reinforce the main conclusions of that book? Maybe you should tell us what the main conclusions of that book were for those of us who did not read it.
Yeah. I think this is the David Kurtzer book.
Yes.
And he's an incredible historian, has written amazing work on the Vatican and the Holocaust. And it is condemns in part the Vatican's lack of action during the Holocaust. The ways in which he was able to determine that had to do with looking at materials that had been released for the Vatican, also considering what was missing from those files before they had the 2020 big release, and also trying to kind of look at other types of archives, other local church archives, correspondence to kind of get at this history, survival testimony from Jews who've been deported from Rome. And I think that he's been at the archives, he's written some articles since, and I think his opinions have held about the Vatican as well. But a lot of that book talks about, too, the deal that the Vatican made, basically. For like 100 years, the Vatican did not participate in political life within Italy. It was like, sorry for this analogy, but like a stubborn kid. Basically, the Vatican used to have a whole big territory all of its own, and its toy got taken away, its land got taken away, and it was mad about it. So it refused to play with the other kids. It didn't participate at all in politics or daily life. And that didn't change until 1929, 1928. The Vatican made a deal with Mussolini that they could have their own sovereign land. The Vatican became Vatican City, but as part of that deal, they couldn't be involved in political life. And so he speaks very, with great criticism about the Vatican making this deal and then not speaking out when these laws were enacted in Italy that condemned the Jews, and then later German occupation. So a lot of that still, I think, holds.
Yeah, David was the first scholar in the Vatican archives, the first American scholar, actually.
Oh.
Yes, he was there.
Wow.
He was there March 4th of 2020. And as Alexis said, for the Pope and Mussolini, he consulted archives around the world, and the Vatican. He used, I think, 3 separate Vatican archives and small collections within each one. Mm-hmm. But he's quite honest about that. And the book has a specific question. David's question is, how did Pius XII make decisions as regards Mussolini and Hitler, and why? So that was the specific question that he had. I think that he concludes. Alexis is absolutely right. David concludes that for Pius XII, these concordats with different foreign countries that protect the rights of the church, Catholic buildings, institutions, schools, religious life, the first priority was protecting those agreements that were made with lots of different European countries and protecting Catholic life in the Vatican. What I hope in the wake of David's book is that we think a little bit more broadly about the church than just the Pope, and that we start asking about the bishops, the priests, the religious orders, ordinary Catholics, and we start asking bigger and more questions. David will be speaking at a conference we have coming up in Rome in October, his first invitation to a Vatican sponsored event. Yep.
Wow.
Yep.
Here's another question from the audience. How much information is enough for you to feel that you understand what happened, to understand the topic?
I just gave a lecture to my students of how they will never understand. You can know all you want, but you'll never understand. Same. No, I mean, honestly, that's the goal. If I ever felt like I knew it all, there'd be something wrong with me. I'd be deluding myself. And for many reasons, one of which is that, told you, I've already confessed I'm addicted to Primo Levi. He's my favorite writer. And in his final book, he says that the only people who really understood and knew the Holocaust are no longer alive. They're the ones who lost their lives during the Holocaust. And I respect that point of view.
I hear that questioner saying, when will you find peace? And I don't think anybody who experienced or engages history ever does.
Well, I have one final question for both of you, and I see we have 1 minute left, so this is good.
Oh.
It just turned to 0, but okay, we're going to call it 1 minute left. What do you want us to remember as we leave here tonight about this era? If we can take one thing that we can remember away with us.
Yeah. Question your traditions and institutions and expect transparency.
Yeah. I echo that and also say what we learn from this history is you don't have to hate other people to be involved in their destruction.
So true.
Meaning that you can be indifferent, or?
You can be indifferent, you can close your eyes and still be part of a system that is set on hate. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for...
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Suzanne and Alexis, for your work and for sharing it with us in such an insightful way. It's been really fascinating to have a window into your research. Thank you. Jason, thank you for bringing out the best from them, and in this discussion, you did a great job.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us this evening. Special thanks to the Toby family, Toby Philanthropies, Sean, Shana, thank you for being here with us. And now this program of the Commonwealth Club is adjourned. See you again soon.